Matthias, thanks very much for coming by today. It's
Pleasure.
End of the year time, and because you are a colleague of ours at SAIS, and you essentially kind of do the same type of work we do here, comparing notes on what's going on either side of the Atlantic. And you've written a fine essay for us in which you describe Germany's changing roles in Europe. Grand facilitator, if you want to call that, facilitating in chief, or whatever you want to call it. But you've just gotten back from Europe, and you look forward to 2016 with me now and say, looking at Germany, where do you think that there is going to be an uncomfortable role for Germany in the coming year with regard to the three issues that you mentioned, the Eurozone, the foreign policy issues, and the immigration issue? Which is going to be a difficult slog for Germany, most difficult, and in particular, what I am particularly interested in your view on is what is the sense in Europe of Germany's emerging role, whatever you call it, facilitator-in-chief, or whatever it might be.
Enforcer-in-chief, benefactor-in-chief.
Whatever you want to call it.
No, this is, I mean, it's an excellent question. If you look at 2016, I think all three are going to play. So, I mean, in the essay I wrote for you, I talked about Germany's role in the Euro crisis mainly as the enforcer of the rules. It's kind of going back to basics, the basics of Maastricht. The German nightmare scenario that they didn't want to play out did play out in 2010, meaning, the fiscal profligacy and things like this. And if you look at 2016, what's going to happen in the Euro crisis, I think, the Greek issue is going to come back. And I think, because, simply the austerity measures and the reforms are, for any government are impossible to do, especially on the back of already 7 years of austerity that have been underway. But what you see is that Germany it used to be, in the Greek scenario, it was Greece versus the rest. That seems to be breaking, right? And the recent elections in Spain have shown this. The recent elections in Portugal have shown this. What's interesting about those two elections is that they were kind of explained by the financial press mainly as a kind of victory for the center-right and austerity-minded governments. But if you look at the numbers, that's not the case at all, right? The center-right in Portugal lost its absolute majority, lost a tremendous amount of votes, 12%. Rajoy and the Partido Popular lost even more, right? So there has been a big swing towards the left. Podemos didn't win the elections, but out of nothing they get 20%. That's astonishing for any party, right? The same with the kind of anti-Euro left in Portugal. So you have them, the left, clamoring for power in Portugal and maybe in power in Spain. You have them in power in Italy. You have them in power in France. You have them in power in Greece. This is the real left, right? This is, much more reformist left in Italy and France. But Spain, Portugal, and Greece, much more kind of center-left to left. They do not see Germany and what Germany is doing for the Eurozone as good for the long term and good for their country, where I think the north of Europe does. So I think enforcer of the rules, these are now seen much more as rules that serve the north of Europe and don't serve the south.
Let me interrupt with one question on that particular issue, because, there is this pushback against Brussels in the EU and sort of a blowback, if you will, in many countries in Europe. And does that become more the blowback directed at Berlin rather than Brussels, or is it somehow, is Germany replacing Brussels as the bad guy over in Europe?
You put your finger on the wound, right? It gets conflated sometimes, I think, because it's seen that the rules and the way Europe runs now is very much in Germany's interest,
right,
and to the tune of what Germany wants and benefiting Germany. They can refinance their debt at negative rates. They have a weak euro, which most analysts expect is going to go to parity sometime later in 2016, maybe not immediately, maybe much of it is priced in. But these are things that benefit Germany.
And that's the way it's being perceived.
That's the way it's being perceived in much of Southern Europe.
Okay, let's pursue that same line of thinking with regard to the immigration issue.
Yeah. So on the immigration issue, I've called Germany the benefactor-in-chief, right? So everything that people like myself have criticized Germany for doing on the Eurozone, here's this Chancellor of the Year, Chancellor of the world, Time Person of the Year 2015, who does something that I think most people don't see coming from a kind of center-right traditional CDU, especially in coalition with a CSU that's more and more powerful on this stuff. What you do see is that wir schaffen das, great, but they cannot do it on their own, really, right? So they see the limits of this policy, where they're taking on all the burden, the human burden, the humanitarian burden on themselves. And you see, there's a country like Sweden with a center-left government that basically says, no, we have no more capacity. Denmark, who's thinking of passing laws where, refugees have to give their valuables so they can pay for it. These are the kind of things that we thought Europe had long gone past. It's not clear that Germany can correct this, right? And that they have the kind of moral leadership to change this. I think it seems to me so far, the rest of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, are incredibly comfortable with Germany taking on that burden. They just send these refugees to Germany. They've said they will take it on.
Let me complicate that picture, because you mentioned the left growing in stance. I personally worry about the right. And you just mentioned Eastern Europe, and I'm thinking Warsaw, I'm thinking Budapest. How does that play out here?
No, that's one of those things where, interestingly enough, here are countries, especially Poland and I think Hungary are the most striking, where they're also breaking the rules, not the economic rules of the Eurozone, because they're not members of the Eurozone, but the political rules of the game, right? The rule of law, the kind of independence of the media, things like this that we take for granted that Europe consolidates. It's not clear again here that there's much that Germany or Brussels or the other member states can do. Here I think there's more of a political game at play and there's the darker side of this kind of great chancellor that we've seen in power for like over a decade now, is that in the end they're members of the European People's Party. They need the votes, they want the power in the European Parliament, and so for political reasons they're not willing to push both Orban and the new, even though of course the new Polish government is part of the reformist group that's led by kind of Cameron's conservatives. So they're more willing to push Poland, but they're not willing as much to push Orban. So it's complicated, right? Politics kind of plays in between. But I think you're absolutely right in worrying about the right, because the center right, especially after this, the great success of Marine Le Pen and the Front National, they're taking over some of the language on immigration and of the extreme right. And that does not bode well for the upcoming elections, as we've talked about previously in 2016. In Germany, right, where Merkel does feel not just the CSU and her own coalition, but the pressure of the Alternative für Deutschland, that clearly, as much as they're skeptical of her Euro policy, they don't think she was tough enough. They think she's way too liberal in the American sense on immigration.
Right, and that, of course, will be tested out in 2016. She's got 5 state elections coming up, and the big election, of course, in 2017. Let's move over to the third issue, facilitator-in-chief.
Yep.
I always found that concept a little bit puzzling to me, because I wasn't sure what that has to do with the same kind of concept that puzzled me, which was leading from the middle.
Yep.
Either one of them was not particularly clear to me what that means. But here it is being tested primarily with regard to Crimea or to Ukraine and possibly in other theaters. Is that something that you see in 2016 now being tested again?
Absolutely.
How?
The sanctions is going to come up in June, and it's going to be very hard to renew it. Matteo Renzi has said as much, and I think there's a lot of pressures within Germany to soften those sanctions as well. You know this better than I do. Germany has a very long-standing relationships on trade, but also culturally. And now on Nord Stream, you see very clearly that there are,
Nord Stream 2, right?
Nord Stream, that there are two standards, right? Renzi was furious about this. Like, well, so the South Stream couldn't happen because they wanted the European Energy Union. And then Nord Stream, there is no. So you do see this kind of concept of Kudnani, of Steve Szabo, this kind of idea of a geo-economic power that's still very much at play, right? Germany does have interests. They have an export-driven economy. They're energy dependent on Russia. In June, now that it's clear that we need Russia in the Middle East, that we need them on Iran, that we need them on all these other issues, need them on global warming, the sanctions have worked, quote unquote, as in they've brought Russia down on its knees economically, but they haven't worked in a way that Crimea seems forever lost. And it also hasn't worked in a sense that, Russia now feels that they have to play by the rules of the game again. So from that point of view, I'm probably more skeptical than most analysts in Washington, D.C., where they say, but look, Merkel fantastically kept the alliance together and NATO together. I was like, well, if that's the measure of success, okay, but that's a rather low bar, right? I mean, to me, the bar is Putin, is it made clear to Putin that he can never do this again? Is he going to give Crimea back to Ukraine? Is there going to be a lasting ceasefire? I mean, all these things are it's a frozen conflict. I mean, if it's like a kind of new sort of Cold War, even though it isn't really the same kind of scale. But from that point of view, I also think that the Western alliance on this is going to weaken, right? And you feel it very much from Renzi's push, but I think it's going to come from Germany as well.
It's important to pay attention to. I mean, that was the confusion that I felt about, when I first heard the concept leading from the middle, I said, the middle of what? And then the second thing was facilitating, but what are you facilitating? But let me go to the big picture at the end here, Matthias, because, I mean, you're European yourself. I mean, do you worry, as many people do? I heard Mr. Verheugen say the other day that this whole thing could fall apart like a deck of cards. I mean, the glue that has kept Europe together, as has been basically paid for and really championed by Germany for all these years for many, many different reasons, seems to be losing its traction. And so the question, I guess, is for you, is Germany nevertheless, despite all the weaknesses that you pointed out, still, despite being chairman of the board and despite being so powerful as it is, the only country that is holding up the flag of the EU in comparison to the other 27?
Yep, it is. What's really striking on the latest polls of Eurobarometer and the Pew results and the transatlantic surveys and so on is that Germany is now by far the country that believes most in that European integration is a good thing.
Right.
And I think because European integration is very much aligned now, at least it's perceived to be aligned with German preferences, with German interests, with German ideas on where Europe should be going. But it's exactly the opposite in much of the rest of Europe, and I think that's what's worrisome.
So what does Merkel need to do in 2016 to correct that image, if she can?
I think they're going to need to do something on the euro. And it's gonna be towards solidarity, the way they've shown solidarity with refugees. And it's gonna have to be deposit insurance. It's gonna have to be some sort of promise that over the next couple of years they'll think really seriously about a Eurobond, some sort of, kind of mutualization of Eurozone debt in return for all the reforms that they think the rest of Europe needs to do. Because so far it's really been, we guarantee the euro, but we don't really do anything to fix the kind of fundamental design flaws of the euro. I mean, it's still a banking union it's on on two legs and not on three, right? So the stool doesn't really stand. The same on I think on security affairs, and I think that's probably the most interesting thing that in my latest research I've been thinking about a lot. We used to think that the economic stuff was easy for European integration, right? It's win-win, you give some, you take some, but if anybody becomes better, and then it's just a question of how to divide the spoils of these victories in economic integration. I'm starting to think that we've reached the limits. Monetary union is not just a technocratic exercise, it's a very political exercise with winners and losers, right? Where, some people win, some countries lose. It seems to me in the security realm, there's much more consensus now. I mean, a European army 15 years ago, or even 12 years ago during the Iraq War, seemed crazy, right? I mean, there was too many different interests. And now it seems to me the high politics, the traditional things of high politics, security, foreign policy, is something where a lot more can be done. And Germany itself can invest a lot more. I mean, it has the fiscal room. but they could take the lead together with France and the UK to talk about kind of common military, common foreign policy, common security policy, and that I think is something that's attractive for this UK as well, because I mean they're not interested that much in spending a lot of money, right? Mm-hmm. So pooling resources, finding cost savings, and so on. At a time where I think broadly Europe's interests, I don't think they've ever been more aligned. The major European powers, think France, Britain, and Germany, their main interests are aligned with Russia, with the Middle East, with North Africa, with refugees. And so I think there could be a lot more room for further integration.
But I see the point, but at the end of the day, somebody's going to have to up and articulate this.
Yep.
And somebody's going to have to do that, and it really seems like, once again, we're pointing back to Berlin.
It seems to be the only player that can, right? I mean, and that's where, just if you look at all the indicators over the last 5 years, I mean, Germany really has become much more powerful within the European Union. And again, it doesn't have to be a hegemon in a kind of terrible way. It could be a stabilizer, the way Britain traditionally played in the 19th century, but also in the Kindleberger fashion, right, where it just provides these public goods where Germany pays a higher price and maybe shares a bit more of the burden, but also benefits a lot more from this. And I think that should be clear now to most Germans, that they've done very well out of this euro, right? Mm-hmm. And that it wouldn't be a bad idea to invest a bit more in a kind of common currency.
With the idea of not only building more institutions at the upper level of the elites, but also perhaps to rally a Europe of 500 million people that need to have a sense of, why are we doing this?
Yep.
And I think that's one of the things that really is almost automatically in the court of Merkel in Berlin, because there's very few other people that can do that at this point.
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, I'm reminded by someone who once said, we built a whole lot of European institutions, and now we have to build Europeans, and that's a real challenge. We'll see what happens, and you'll keep us posted.
Yep.
Matthias, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Great to have you with us.
Pleasure.